we have had a lot of questions that people have asked. You have seen a number of financial crises in your time, not that you're old or anything, but can you tell us really in what way is the corona financial crisis that inevitably is going to happen, according to the IMF, going to be different from the last one we had in 2008?
Well, there was one fundamental difference to 2008. 2008 was a crash caused by a bubble. Basically, interest rates have been way too low for way too long, and the well of speculative activity had built up in the economy, and got the whole subprime mortgage thing and people leveraging themselves up to the hilt, including banks leveraging themselves up. So that was actually what in economics you would call an endogenous event.
Endogenous event.
Basically,
So what does that mean?
It was caused by the system.
Oh.
Many people were shocked by it, but they really shouldn't have been shocked by it. They may have been shocked by the extent of it, but the fact that it happened was almost inevitable, because asset prices, house prices, subprime mortgages, the whole lot was going up and up in value, and nobody seemed to think that that was a problem. So to an extent that was caused by economic policy. Whereas you'd have to be quite harsh to judge the coronavirus as something that was deliberately caused. So that is what economists would describe as an exogenous shock. It's more akin to what would happen if there was a big meteor strike and wiped out the dinosaurs, for example. So it's important to differentiate between the endogenous shock that destroyed the banking system to the exogenous shock that just came out of nowhere and it's produced a big collapse in the economy.
So has there been in living memory any other exogenous shock that might have caused a financial crisis?
Well, the one people sometimes refer to are the oil shocks in the 1970s. So obviously they were caused because OPEC limited the supply of oil and drove its price up. But as far as the rest of the global economy was concerned, that was a shock that hadn't been factored into their economic models and caught everybody out very badly. So that's another exogenous shock. But I think that's actually quite telling that most of the crises nowadays do tend to have been caused rather than actually just happened randomly. So basically, if you're in a situation, and increasingly we find ourselves in that situation where low interest rates are used to stimulate the economy, as they have been for the last 30 or 40 years, to be honest, you get into the situation where if you overstimulate the economy and if asset prices go up too much, then you're putting yourself in a situation where if something bad happens, everything collapses very, very quickly. So even to that extent, the current crisis, you could argue that low interest rates right the way around the world meant that the stock markets were higher than they would normally have been. Certainly bond markets were a lot higher than they would have been. So they were kind of primed for a bit of a correction, even though the cause of the correction wasn't something that anybody had predicted. So what we're left with is a situation where the prescription for this crisis is pretty much the same as the prescription for the last crisis, and for every crisis we've sort of seen over the past sort of 30 or 40 years. It's a substantial cut in interest rate and easing of monetary policy. But that policy response doesn't spread its goodness to everybody. So, and what I mean by that is if you cut interest rates, say in the UK, we've cut base rates to 0.1% to try and stimulate the economy and to soften the blow of the additional borrowing individuals and companies are going to have to make. But if you own a house and you've got a £300,000 mortgage, for example, just for example, cutting interest rates by 0.6%, which is what happened as a result of the crisis in two moves, 15 basis points and 50 basis points. In fact, that's 65 basis points, isn't it? That will save somebody with a £300,000 mortgage, that will save them £1,800 a year or £150 a month. if you haven't got a house, if you're renting, you're not going to see any of that. And this has been replicated for the past few decades, that all the efforts to stimulate the economy whenever it's threatened to slow down have been biased towards supporting those with assets such as houses or pensions, stuff like that, or those with good access to credit, so you're earning enough that people are quite happy to lend you money. So if you're not in either of those situations, actually you're, even before this current crisis, you were as like as not worse off in 2019 than you would have been in 2007, just before the financial crisis. So that's created a very imbalanced economy, or unbalanced economy, where actually, there's a saying, money goes to money. It literally does. If you've got enough money to own financial assets, you are the people who are gaining the biggest benefit from attempts to stimulate the economy.
Okay, so if the normal financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, was an endogenously caused crisis, can we think of any endogenous solutions that would actually more equitably distribute the benefits to more members of society, rather than just money going to money?
Well, the critical thing this time around, it's the economy is a metaphor, would be a burning building at the moment, and people are running in and out trying to save valuables and stuff like that, and the valuables they're trying to save are jobs and businesses in this metaphor. And the way you can protect the jobs is by having some of the furloughing schemes that we've talked about. But Germany did a scheme called Kurzarbeit in 2008, which saved an enormous number of jobs. Basically, it was making up people's wages and allowing companies to put their workers on short time when demand suddenly dropped because of the financial crisis. And in the end, it actually saved Germany an enormous amount of money, because it meant that as soon as the crisis was started to sort of ebb, these workers were back fully employed. It meant they hadn't permanently lost jobs. It meant that within a very short space of time, German unemployment was a fraction of what was seen anywhere else. So it actually saved the government an enormous amount of money in sort of unemployment benefits and related sort of welfare sort of payments. And given that they are proportionately higher in Germany than they are in the UK anyway, that was an enormous amount of money to be saved. But the difference between Germany then and now, to be fair, it's sort of putting in similar sorts of measures now, is that the UK and the US are more gig-based economies. So it's much more difficult to get to the people who need help and to maintain their jobs, make sure they're not destroyed, make sure smaller businesses aren't destroyed. And this is critical to how we come out of it. How much do we manage to salvage from the wreckage, and in what sort of shape, will be absolutely critical to how we progress and grow afterwards. So delays, making mistakes, mistakes will happen, but not correcting mistakes will be a big problem.
Now, I must admit that it's not really looking like we can have a win-win situation going forward. Is there any hope?
The situation is never hopeless, but you've got to remember that this is an evolving situation. So if you're trying to make a forecast now, you're having to make a forecast of how policymakers would respond. And one of the reasons economists got the recovery from the financial crisis so badly wrong in Europe, that it was much more lackluster than they'd expected, is that economists quite reasonably assumed that if we were faced with a really, really big crisis, we'd actually do something about it, like sort of making sure that banks were in a good shape to start lending to their clients again. And that never happened. So that's why it hit Europe proportionately harder than the US. even though the problem arguably originated in the US, because the US responded, it got its banks back into shape forcibly, and reaped the benefit of it. Its recapitalisation of its banking system actually made a profit, whereas Europe never did that and suffered the consequences of pretty much a decade of below trend growth.
So we are looking for good quality leadership and sensible financial decisions going forward.
Absolutely, because I mean, what happens in the next few years will be determined by what's done in the next few weeks.
Serious.
And thank you all very much for listening. If you have enjoyed it, if you have found it useful, please tell your friends. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and make comments there as well, because if you make comments, that's one way you can get questions to us and we can respond to those, perhaps include it in future shows. And it also flags up issues that other people looking for help and advice on YouTube will see that these questions have been asked and people have subscribed to the service. So please do that, and let's talk again very soon. Love you all lots, and take care out there.